Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 409, and this is episode 5 in a series which I have now retitled Vintage Jazz Bargains. It used to be called 5 Under 20. Don't worry, the same rules will still apply, but Vintage Jazz Bargains is just a title that people find easier to locate on YouTube. So Vintage Jazz Bargains it is going forward. And as I mentioned, the same rules still apply. So here I'll be discussing 5 records, of which, if you looked on Discogs today, you could find at least 3 copies which were early pressings, not necessarily first pressings, but early pressings from around the time of release, which were VG Plus or better, could be near mint, could be VG Plus, but at least 3 early pressings which are VG Plus or better in media condition, which you can find for under $20 US. Now, of course, there are lots of old jazz records you can find even more cheaply, but these are ones which I consider to be particularly good, of particularly high quality. They're records that I could easily discuss in my other series, Jazz Under the Radar. But these are ones which I guarantee, at least today, you could find for cheap. So the first record I want to talk about today is this one. It is a very nice, colorful record. Well, colorful cover anyway. It's called Jazz in 4 Colors. It's by the Levy Quartet. Came out on RCA Victor in 1956. And the lineup here in West Coast terms is pretty all-star. Stan Levy on drums, Lou Levy on piano, the leader, Leroy Vinnegar on bass, and Larry Bunker on vibes. And if you know anything about the list of musicians I just mentioned, you'll know that they're all pretty much, to a person, rhythm-focused players. So if you're suspecting that this record might swing, well, it does swing. Although you'd put it very squarely, I think, in the cool jazz rather than the hard bop lane. Lou Levy was an excellent piano player. He came from Chicago, which has produced more than its fair share of great jazz pianists. He led quite a few record dates, but he's principally known in terms of his career, I would suggest, more as somebody who accompanied others, particularly Ella Fitzgerald, on some of her great recordings for Verve. He also featured in some of the very best small groups of the 1950s, including those of Shorty Rogers, who I think one can infer from the notes here, certainly from his authorship of liner notes, was probably the producer of this, and also in one of the better groups led by Stan Getz. The other players here are largely drawn from the top rank of West Coast musicians in the mid-1950s. Stan Levy and Leroy Vinnegar I've discussed at length at various points on the channel. I'll just linger here on Larry Bunker. He's on here playing vibes, but you may know of him as a drummer because he was the guy that replaced Chico Hamilton in Jerry Mulligan's early West Coast group. He also played drums for Art Pepper and then in the 1960s for Bill Evans. And as the jazz scene in California starts to, well, wither or wind down, whatever you want to call it, in the late 60s, he goes on to a long and happy life doing studio work for film and TV. This is a really enjoyable record. There are quite a few gems on RCA Victor in and amongst the broad mass of material that label was putting out. Shorty Rogers also led a great group on RCA Victor at the time. Anyway, this is definitely worth picking up, and you should be able to get it, at least today, for not too much money. Now, the next record I want to talk about is a little bit, well, it's not from left field because it's a good label and a good artist, but it's got a very peculiar kind of pitch. It's Buddy Collette's Swinging Shepherds. Now, there are 3 things to know about this record. First of all, none of the people that are pictured on the cover are actually shepherds in any way. They're solely musicians, and one of the giveaways for that is they're wearing monk costumes from the Middle Ages, which look like they've been sourced from Central Casting, and I think probably got recycled at some point in the shooting of Spinal Tap. This is, I would submit to you, one of the most awkward album covers ever released by a legit jazz star on a legit jazz label, putting it in the company of albums like Herbie Mann's Push Push. But having said that, they're all here. Here's Buddy Collette, the leader. There is Bud Shank back by the tree playing away. This is Harry Klee with the jumbo flute down below. And there is Canada's own Paul Horn. Paul Horn, like most Canadians, affecting a friendly grin while probably secretly plotting to treat the United States very, very badly. So unfairly. The second thing I'd mention about this record, and this may come as a bit of a surprise, is that in order to get the most out of this, you probably need to enjoy the flute. And there are a lot of flutes on here. Bass flutes, regular flutes, piccolos, the whole flute and match. It's not like they're trying to be subtle about it. If you have just 1 flute in a band, you can do the odd solo and make it seem like a regular jazz group. If you've got 4 flutes, well, there's no hiding, is there? But the third thing to say about this record, having said all of that, is that it's actually really enjoyable. There are some really creative arrangements on here. As you might expect, occasionally it threatens to move a little bit close to Nutcracker territory, but in general, this still swings pretty hard, and I recommend it. Now, the next record to discuss is one by our old friend The Velvet Fog, Mel Tormé. It's released on Bethlehem in, when was it? 1957. Mel is singing the songs of Fred Astaire, and he's supported by Marty Paich and his Dectet, which, for those of you who are not sufficiently versed in the overlapping Venn diagrams of the Greek language and musical theory, is a group of 10 musicians. And some pretty good musicians too. So in addition to Marty Paich, and I've sung his praises with some regularity, who is playing piano, but he's also leading and arranging. Herb Geller, wonderful player on alto. Jack Montrose is a tenor saxophonist, but he's also a well-known arranger, was at the time. So you've got two people in this band who are really quite concerned not just with their own playing, but with the overall fit and the way the whole thing congeals. So it does sound really, really good. Pete Candoli is here on trumpet. He's joined on trumpet by Don Fagerquist. Bob Enevoldsen on valve trombone. A lot of these guys were going back and forth between the jazz studios and the TV and film studios out in LA. Now, there's a near consensus, I would suggest, amongst fans of jazz vocals that Mel Tormé, first of all, had a wonderful, wonderful voice, and secondly, that he did his very best work while he was a Bethlehem artist. In fact, Tormé himself said about the folding of Bethlehem, or the basically disappearing off the map of Bethlehem in the early 1960s, that I never left Bethlehem, Bethlehem left me. And there's something about the freedom that he was afforded on the records that he made for Bethlehem. This one, there's another really great one called It's a Blue World. There's also one kind of a festival of excess called his California Suite. Something about the way these records were produced just leaves you with a feeling that he is completely at ease. His nickname, of course, was the Velvet Fog, and I defy you, with respect, to find a male jazz vocalist who turns in a more appealing and luxurious performance than Tormé does here. If you're around my vintage, you may have first encountered Mel Tormé as this older, kind of Vegas-y singer who would show up as a guest star on the Carol Burnett Show, and that was certainly true. That's what he did. But in the last year or so, couple of years, I've been gathering his Bethlehem recordings and some of the other ones he did, like on Gene Norman Presents and so on, and the beauty of the music just cannot be denied. And it's also a remarkably fun record because it's basically all standards that you'll know. So, Nice Work If You Can Get It, A Fine Romance, Let's Call the Whole Thing Off, The Way You Look Tonight, They Can't Take That Away From Me, Cheek to Cheek. You get the idea. So, what can I say? Take the plunge with the Velvet Fog. Now, the fourth record I want to talk about is by Shelly Manne and his men playing Peter Gunn. Now, you may have encountered this record in the bins or the stacks or whatever it is one flips through, and you may just have flipped right by it thinking, oh, this is some kind of TV soundtrack record. I don't want anything to do with it. Well, it is and it isn't. It is kind of a TV soundtrack record in that the music is from the TV series Peter Gunn, but it is jazz interpretations of that soundtrack, ably assisted by Henry Mancini, who scored the original music, and he arranges this music for a sextet led by Shelly Manne. Now, everyone, of course, knows the music, or at least the title track. Even if you don't think you've heard it, you probably heard it. And the version on here of that is really great, but so is the rest of the record. And it's not too surprising because this is pretty much a first call West Coast lineup. Shelly Manne, of course, never made a bad record. Victor Feldman, Conte Candoli, mentioned him earlier. Herb Geller, mentioned him earlier. Russ Freeman on piano, did some great work with Chet Baker, and Monty Budwig on bass. This is a group which Manne had just before he formed his quintet, which would go on to make those four wonderful Live at the Blackhawk records. Some of them are already on board. Feldman was part of that quintet. Monty Budwig was part of that quintet. But Joe Gordon and Richie Kamuka have yet to come into the picture. Now, I rarely ever rag on other people's reviews of music, but All Music gave this record 2.5 stars for reasons I suppose best known to themselves. Rarely has a review been so off base. This record is a delight from start to finish. Shelly Manne is in the pocket, as he always is, but I'd actually like to single out, amongst all the excellent performances on here, the horns. Herb Geller and Conte Candoli are superb all the way through this. And it's also released in wonderful contemporary stereo, which were probably the best sounding records and certainly the best sounding stereo records of the late 1950s, that early stereo era. So look out for this, grab it if you see it, and note also there is a sequel record which came out on contemporary as well. I think plays more music with Peter Gunn or something like that. That's good too, grab that as well. Now, the last record I want to talk about in this episode is kind of, one of these things is not like the others. The first four records that I've talked about are all pleasantly swinging, accessible records from the 1950s. This record, Lament for Booker Ervin, is mostly from the 1960s, a little bit from the 1970s. And the first thing I'd say is that while this record certainly is within the mainstream jazz category. It is full of challenging and exploratory tenor sax playing from the wonderful Booker Ervin. If one were organizing a record collection thematically, and I do not recommend that at all, so just get that thought out of your head, but if you were organizing a record collection thematically, you could put this alongside the work done by Eric Dolphy or John Coltrane between, say, 1962 and 1964. I say that because this is emotional playing, although it's less out than the two musicians I just mentioned, or certainly less out than Albert Ayler or the more passionate parts of Pharoah Sanders' work. Booker Ervin, of course, dies sadly very young at age 39 in 1970 from a kidney ailment. But this is made in 1965 while he's on tour in Germany, and he really is at the peak of his powers. He's in inspired form, and he's got a great band. He's got his regular drummer, Allan Dawson, he's got Kenny Drew on piano, and the great Dane, the bassist Niels Henning Ørsted Pedersen. Now, there are only 2 tracks in this record, and the main one, Blues for You, was recorded live at the Berlin Jazz Festival in October 1965, where the band were told that they had to keep their set somewhat strangely to 15 minutes. So Booker says, thanks very much, and he gets up and he plays for 28 minutes, so it's split over 2 sides here. It's magical, it's free-flowing, it's passionate, it's intense, it's challenging but not inaccessible, and I have to say it really has grown on me with repeated listenings. But that's not all that's on this record, because there's also a lovely track which is added 5 years after Ervin's death, I suppose to pad the record out for release. Whether or not it needed it, who knows. But it's a piece by Horace Parlan, who was a close friend of Booker Ervin's, and it's preceded by this really lovely and touching verbal introduction, and the music itself is lovely. It's unaccompanied piano. Anyway, pick this one up. For some reason, it's not particularly recherché at the moment, but that's not for any good reason. So those are the 5 vintage jazz bargains for this time. I wish you good luck in finding those. Please do add your comments on other suggestions or on these records. I always enjoy those, and I look forward to seeing you next time.